counterproductive one-size-fits-all approach. Gillen 22 writes, advocates overstate the problem. Most students do not borrow, and typical repayment burdens are reasonable. Advocates jump from outliers. The solution does not match the problem. It would be like arguing hurricanes pose a danger to the Gulf and devoting resources to Montana. The appropriate policy is more likely scalpels than sledgehammers. Existing solutions are ignored. Unaffordable student loans have been solved by policymakers as a series of income-driven repayment programs like Repay were established. Payment is adjusted based on income to ensure payments are always affordable. These programs already have loan forgiveness built in. Universal forgiveness would reinvent the wheel. While not perfect, programs are the best alternatives. Thus, new initiatives will continue to form. Hyatt 23 finds, the SAVE plan is much more generous than previous IDR. Payments are 10% of disposable income. Borrowers who make $32,800 or less will have payments of $0. It takes a ton of pressure off. Additionally, forgiveness misses the forest for the trees. Oldham 22 writes, amount is not the issue. If cancellation is not accompanied by systemic reforms, we will certainly arrive at this pass again. Regulatory failures compounded the crisis. A one-time jubilee is not enough. Specifically, CRFB 22 predicts outstanding federal loan debt will return to its current level in 2028 if all loans are canceled. Thus, our sole contention is one step forward and two steps back. Increased debt forgiveness would have the perverse effect of increasing reckless borrowing. Gillen 22, students would be encouraged to increase their borrowing. Forgiveness would create moral hazard. The notion that passive forgiveness will be repeated. One college's campaign told students, stop wasting your money on student loan payments. Imagine how much students will borrow when that becomes the conventional wisdom among, instead, a third of borrowing, all would borrow as much as possible. Grieg and Sullivan 21 further. If people believe debt would be forgiven in the future, they may take out more debt or repay more slowly. Claims of a one-time cancellation are less credible. One-time forgiveness does nothing to reduce the debt accrued tomorrow. Consumers won't be alone. Grieg and Sullivan 21 write, colleges would be encouraged to raise tuition commensurately. Forgiving student debt will send a terrible message to these same universities that already gouge customers. Tuition will never come back to earth. Accountability would disappear overnight. Carrington 19. Nobody's on the hook for the cost of higher education in a post-forgiveness world. Blanket forgiveness could create moral hazard on the part of schools, knowing students have easy access to money. If students aren't responsible, then neither party is. While schools are currently motivated by competitive forces to offer quality programs and admit students who can succeed, this may be mitigated by broad-stroke forgiveness. Thus, McCluskey 22 confirms, when presented with potential downsides, sentiment flips from support to opposition. For every dollar in subsidized student loans, colleges raise prices 60 cents. Ultimately, Burke 20 concludes, it's a cycle that would throw gasoline on the bonfire of college tuition. The result is a policy that backfires entirely. Gillen 22 explains, if high tuition and overborrowing are the root causes, proposing a solution that makes both worse is counterproductive. Forgiveness would treat the symptom rather than the disease, and inadvertently make the disease worse. This is the equivalent of putting explosives into a can before kicking it down the road. This is recognized by both sides of the political spectrum, and very importantly, the money required for federal forgiveness can and would be better spent elsewhere. Gillen 22 writes, loan forgiveness also has a high opportunity cost. Spending $1.6 trillion will reduce funding for other issues. For the same cost of extending payment pauses for a year, we could triple Pell Grants. Similarly, the annual cost is 5 times the total to provide free community college. While this may have been justified in the depths of the pandemic, it is no longer making sense. Forgiving loan efforts divert resources, time, and attention. Do this once and we'll get more lobbying. Forgiveness will be rolled back. Carry 23. New student debt relief is doomed to fail. It has major questions, is unconstitutional for federal agencies, does not have clear authorization, and is vast, unclear, and meaning whatever the court wants, it will get. HEA only authorizes loan forgiveness in limited circumstances.
For Durham HH, going second on the pro. And unless anyone's not ready, this will be the pro start. Education, once hailed as the great pathway to a prosperous future, has become a failed promise. For the first time in American history, CNN reports in 2020 that a new generation of Americans are worse off than their parents in income, job status, and well-being. Millions of students' dreams across the country are crushed by the burden of tens of thousands of dollars in student loans that the generation before did not have. In fact, Melanie Hansen of the Education Data Initiative reports that students with loan payments are nearly 40% less likely to purchase a house, while 1 out of every 5 recipients of food stamps are college graduates. Today, Hansen explains that the problem is only getting worse. In the 21st century alone, federal student loans have increased by nearly 400%. Thus, we advocate that the United States federal government should forgive all federal student loan debt. Our sole contention is reviving the American dream. Forgiving student loan debt is key to preserving America's prosperity in 2 ways, and the first is by guaranteeing equal opportunities for all. Student loans are devastating for America's youth. Between massive expenses and decades-long harms, America's future is in jeopardy. Alicia Adamczyk of CNBS reports in 2022 that 70% of millennials and Gen Z have put off major life decisions like buying a home because of their student debt. Fortunately, student loan forgiveness gives America's youth the tools they need to figure things out in these trying times. Girdman of Harvard Business School explains in 2019 that without student loan debt, young Americans see 30% better job mobility, pull substantially higher wages, fill critical roles in emerging industries, and pay down other debts by upwards of 25%. These impacts are critical. By paying down their debts and landing high-paying jobs, young Americans are able to prevent defaults on their loans, relieving them of potential lifelong economic devastation. Furthermore, Asha Banerjee of the Center for Law and Social Policy finds in 2021 that college education should be an avenue accessible to all, not just America's most wealthy. By forgiving loan debt, every single American is guaranteed access to the same opportunities that can turn lives around and reverse generational inequalities in this country. Professor Francois Bourguignon of the Paris School of Economics in 2018 explains that by reducing inequality, low-income people can devote more resources to the accumulation of wealth, allowing them to generate higher incomes and maintain wealth across generations. The second way forgiving student loans preserves prosperity is by supporting small businesses. While small businesses were once the epitome of the American dream, they've experienced a devastating decline. Data from Forbes found in January that over the past 30 years, new business creation has fallen by nearly 50%, and in the year before the pandemic, 30% fewer businesses were started than in the 1970s. Thus, this decline began just years after federal student loans began to ravage Americans, and the timing is no coincidence. Indeed, college graduates are no longer able to undertake the ventures college promised them to prepare them for. Stephanie Kelton of the Levi Institute explains in 2018 that student loans make it difficult for individuals to accumulate the money needed to form a startup and worsen credit, preventing them from being approved for loans. As a result, the Roosevelt Institute writes in 2022 that young Americans have been starting fewer businesses. The burden of student debt is stopping an entire generation of Americans from making major life decisions, like starting a business, which directly resulted in 2 million fewer being formed between 2009 and 2016. Thus, Kelton further explains that relieving student loans would create a massive boost in the number of small businesses being started. This revival is critical to America's prosperity. The U.S. Small Business Administration in 2019 concludes that small businesses are the livelihood of the U.S. economy, accounting for nearly half of U.S. economic activity and 80% of new jobs. Thus, The Economist in 2013 found that a more robust U.S. economy could lift huge swaths of people out of poverty. Thus, for all of these reasons, and to rebuild the American dream, we are proud to affirm.
Two pieces of evidence. First one, that inequality increases means wealth increases. Second, that small businesses form because of property and limited loans.
I'll email that and then we can.
Yeah, okay.
Which small businesses? Is it Kelton or?
The one before is the economy impact.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I said that one too. to Kelvin. Okay, I got it.
I'm sure we'll get it. Alright. I'll take first question. So your argument says that job mobility goes up, that people can go to high-paying, very stable jobs for give student loans.
That's right.
So to start a small business, is that hard?
For sure.
So why would people both go for stable, high-income jobs, but also start volatile, risky small businesses?
Wait, so you're asking why do people start small businesses at all, right? I'd say people obviously have different interests. Some people want to get higher paying jobs in more stable industries, and that is something that student loans are also preventing them from doing. And it's something that we can help them do by relieving student debt.
You made an argument that people would be able to switch to high-paying, very stable jobs, but that's the antithesis to what starting a small business means.
I think both of those things can be true. It can both be true that some people would want to start small businesses and some people would want like more stable office jobs.
Okay, we got
All right. So I have a question about income-driven repayment plans. So you talk about, for example, Repay, which was in place for 20 years and that 2 million people qualified for. So in that time, how many people did that program help?
Millions.
32, right?
Well, our argument for SAVE says that the best analysis and most recent evidence finds that 4 million people per year will be helped independently.
No, it says that 4 million people qualify,
Yeah.
right? And your argument for why SAVE is better than Repay is that more people qualify.
No, it says that it would assist millions of people.
I'm sure that it says that, right? But its efficacy in assisting those people is what I'm contesting. Because for a program like Repay, it's something where you have to apply, you have to do loads and loads of paperwork, and
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at.
What I'm getting at is that the solution that I believe in your speech you say is having already solved this problem right now in the past 2 decades, despite 2 million people
obviously
qualifying,
not.
has helped 32
The
people.
first thing to note is that
Which
SAVE
there's more
started
people in this
August.
room.
I think the first thing to note is that SAVE started in August, and then we have not given the program time to build up yet. The thesis of SAVE is that it is during Biden's moratorium that the program was started up. Sure, you can shine all this light on Repay, which we'll answer in further speeches, but the thesis of the SAVE argument is that millions of people will be assisted. The point of our federal government is to learn from its mistakes, which is why new plans factor in new data and help millions of people. But I'll get a question. So you make this argument regarding housing purchases. So what is the state of the U.S. economy right now and like the housing market broadly?
I'd say it's improving. We're coming out of the pandemic, right?
Right, but are prices increasing?
For houses, yeah.
So if houses are increasing and the prices are increasing at a higher rate, how much disposable income does your case give people to buy things like houses?
Obviously, housing is expensive, and neither side really affects how much houses cost. I think it's still probably good. Actually, given what you just told me, it's probably especially good that we allow people to have more money.
The issue is
get
that
housing,
the
right?
housing prices are increasing at such a rapid rate because things like inflation, even if we forgive student loans, we'll never be able to.
Wait, so your argument is since housing is expensive, we should like do more to help people not be able to buy houses?
No, it's a structural issue with the housing market that forgiveness would be ineffective.
Are you taking breath?
Sure. We'll take some money. You guys want to straight down?
Yeah.
It's just gonna be straight down the app. Anyone not ready? Let's run their first argument about equal opportunities. First, forgiveness increases debt, as CRFP 22 writes. Canceling all federal student debt would cost $1.6 trillion. Those costs are recorded as deficit immediately and would be reflected in higher debt levels. There's 2 reasons why this matters. The first is tax rates. In order to finance some of the debt, McNaughton's 21 finds that a surge in debt levels will force policymakers to increase tax revenues. This always on scope because it affects the income of every American. They only help those with loans. The second implication is the economy. Peterson 23 finds that issuing large amounts of federal debt crowds out investment by the private sector, making the economy less productive and stunting wage growth, along with hurting small businesses. This always on scope because A, every American would see lower income, and B, other countries are affected by a weaker U.S. economy, increasing poverty levels. Secondly, student loans wouldn't increase income for those who need it. 2 reasons. First, the most impoverished don't have degrees. Wolf 21 writes, 64% of Americans don't have a bachelor's degree. Secondly, most people in college are already well off, as Gazette 22 finds. Households of college graduates are more affluent, which is why Bomb 21 concludes that beneficiaries of student loans would be higher income, better educated, and
nationwide. Among those making payments on loans, 4% are in poverty. Third, loan forgiveness takes funding away from welfare. As Smith 22 writes, if we spend money on forgiving student loan debt, we won't spend it on other things. Spending cuts would slash important social programs. That's crucial because Bandry 22 quantifies that social programs kept over 25 million people out of poverty, while millions of low-income Americans are supported by expanded programs. Fourthly, affirming would benefit high-income borrowers most, exacerbating inequality. As Buff 23 writes, universal loan forgiveness would benefit wealthier borrowers more than low-income borrowers because high earners took larger loans. Parental income also acts as a security blanket for more affluent families. The benefits will end up accruing to upper-income individuals. You should prefer our evidence because, unlike their analysts, our study comes to the fact that certain loans are expected to be forgiven. Indeed, Looney 22 furthers that the benefits of the bottom quantile average 39 cents per dollar, while the benefits for households in high income quantile is 95 cents on the dollar. Finally, households wouldn't spend anyway. As Percent 22 writes, because households of college graduates are more affluent, they're more likely to save extra money rather than spend it on necessary items, blunting their impact. Next, let's talk about the second argument about small businesses. First, you can turn it because cancellation hurts business productivity. As Wharton 21 finds, a fixed subsidy is unable to undo the decline in entrepreneurship. Policy intervention can make things worse. Interventions have to be funded by tax increases, and new firms may not be as productive and may in fact decline. Secondly, cancellation decreases a business's ability to hire, hurting them in the long run. As Sarah 22 finds, employers provide student loan repayment benefits, adding an opportunity cost to differentiate themselves. Attrition rates among employees participating in this program are 75% lower. New hires say that the benefit was a major factor in the decision to join the company. There's two reasons why this matters. First, business becomes less competitive, hurting the economy, and secondly, workers become less productive because they have a reduced attachment to the company. Thirdly, there are so many alternative causes for low entrepreneurship that the affirmative can't solve for. Wharton 21, entrepreneurship has declined because college graduates earn more in well-paying jobs than their own businesses. Lower prices of goods help businesses become more profitable and hire high-skilled workers who would otherwise have become entrepreneurs. Moreover, Salgado 21, business formation has declined because of labor supply constraints and the aging of the U.S. population. Skill levels of entrepreneurs, however, increased. The decline is the equilibrium to technological improvements that change the incentives of individuals to start their own businesses. Fourthly, there's lack of capital post-forgiveness, which hurts their argument. As Avalo 20 finds, small businesses are facing a life-threatening event. As banks grow in size, it shifts to rely less on interest in community banks, which can't manage investment. Lending becomes an afterthought, and banks are too big to fail. The implication is simple. Even with the debt removed, entrepreneurs can't access capital in the first place because big banks don't have an incentive to offer loans to them anyways. Finally, other programs are already solving. WH23 finds that America has followed 10.5 million new businesses, highest on record as part of Biden's 35 initiative to maintain momentum, including billions in loans. Castro 23 confirms that small businesses are an entrepreneur boom, up 50%, which has never been higher. Finally, their future is short-term, as Wharton 21 writes, post-pandemic business applicants were in retail and are short-term developments. They have a small impact. The forces are still there, such as aging in the population, offshoring, and tech changes. Thus, negate.
Okay, can I see that there's no capital to go to businesses? Yep. Addressing the rebuttal that you just heard, and then it's going to be straight down their case. Everyone ready? The college education, which once promised the American people prosperity, has become a nightmare. uncontested in their rebuttal, is the CNN evidence, which finds that Americans today are the first generation in history to be less well off than their parents and have lower well-being, which means there is a crisis right now. The question is whether we act. On our first contention, they redo a couple responses. First, they claim that when you affirm, it would increase our deficit. But Stiglitz of Columbia University explains that the effect on our deficit would be negligible by an increase in student loan forgiveness because it would be spread out over a long period. In other words, borrowers wouldn't have to repay we wouldn't just give borrowers $1.7 trillion right now, but rather they wouldn't have to pay that amount of payments in the next 20 years. But then, they claim that taxes would increase. But SOAR explains in 2023 that there is no political will in Congress to increase taxes ahead of the upcoming election, which means this impact about taxes would never happen. Second, they say that affirming only increases inequality because most people don't have college degrees. But Collins explains in 2023 that student loan forgiveness actually does help those who need it most. In fact, remember that the resolution is about federal student loans, while Collins reports that the wealthiest borrowers have student loans from private firms, which means they would not be forgiven after you affirm. And second, Banerjee finds that the overwhelming burden of student debt falls on lower income communities, so we can help them when you affirm. Lastly, they say that it would cut welfare, but the U.S. has never taken away from welfare in order to have social spending. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, all of that came from the deficit. It never came from welfare, and we would say there's no political will to cut these popular welfare programs. Lastly, on our argument about small businesses, they just give you a bunch of reasons why cancellation would hurt businesses. But their evidence is reliant on all of the arguments that they make in their case. It's reliant on inflation increasing, and none of those arguments will occur, as I'll explain on their case. Lastly, they say that new initiatives are increasing businesses now, but remember what we tell you on our case, which is that even if businesses are doing okay in the wake of the pandemic, when you forgive student loans, it revitalizes them. Let's go to their case, where there are more questions than answers. At the top, they claim that loan forgiveness is worse than a targeted program, but they give you two targeted programs, neither of them are working. First, they tell you income-based repayment programs will work, but NCLC finds that the very program they talk about helps 32 people over 2 decades. That's not the solution we need. Second, they claim that Biden's SAVE plan will solve, but Nova explains in 2023 that Biden's SAVE plan is a bureaucratic mess, and Sheffy finds that funding for it is going down right now, only making the solution worse. Then, on their argument about recklessness, number one, it's reliant on the idea that borrowers will become more reckless when you forgive student loans. But Edelman finds in 2023 that this isn't the case. In fact, there is no evidence that people will spend more when you forgive their student loans. Instead, Hiltzik, analyzing the past 2 years of forgiveness, finds that individuals tend to save their money and pay off debt rather than going on a spending spree. Secondly, colleges will not increase tuition regardless of student loan forgiveness. Edelman finds, number one, that colleges are not profit-maximizing firms, and number two, that they don't want to be perceived as greedy, which is why they will never increase their tuition prices. Lastly, they say it would come at a high cost, but Collins reports in 2023 that debt forgiveness can be undertaken with little to no cost because we have already had these loan payments repaid. What's left is interest on these borrowers, and we already have enough money to forgive the debt. Lastly, they say the Supreme Court will strike down the affirmative, but their evidence is in the context of the executive, whereas Black finds in 2023 that it would have to be Congress who passes Supreme Court, or who passes loan forgiveness, because they're the only ones authorized to under Supreme Court precedent, so it wouldn't be able to be challenged. You ready for cross?
Can I see Edelman, Coolidge on the page, NCL, and then also.
You want to see Edelman, Collins, NCLC, and is that it?
Maybe that's credible.
So the last piece of evidence one is the NCIC.
Yeah, this one, like, helping you.
All of those pieces of evidence are sent. Are you ready for cross?
Yeah.
So how much is the total?
Like,
35? Okay. You can have the first question.
okay. So what does your NOVA evidence say about Biden's future plans and results carried from these trials?
Yeah, our NOVA evidence more speaks to the present, but our Sheppy evidence speaks towards the future. So I'll start on the NOVA
hold
evidence.
on. So what does your NOVA evidence say about like what Biden's going to do in the future?
Yeah, our NOVA evidence, which I haven't sent to you yet, I sent you the
I also
NOVA
want to say
evidence. Yeah, sure.
No
The
one
evidence
comes to
says
the conclusion that Biden will adopt new data and make his forgiveness programs better and more efficient.
But the NOVA evidence says that while Biden may have attempts to do so, it's currently a bureaucratic mess. And the Sheppy evidence is much better on the future outlook than the NOVA evidence. It looks at the structural problems with these targeted programs, right? It says that the fact that government funding for them is going down right now, and number two, that they just aren't working that well in the future and are getting less and less support every year, demonstrates that if they haven't been working for the past 2 decades, they're not going to work today. Can I have a question? Sure. Okay. So, on your case, you tell me that when we forgive student loans, all of a sudden, students are going to behave like recklessly and they're just going to go out and borrow like enormous sums, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, wouldn't you agree that regardless of whether you affirm or you negate, there's always an incentive for students not to drive themselves into bankruptcy on the hope that one day Joe Biden will forgive their student loans?
No, we made the argument that even if it's not total, we made the argument that the students don't see an opportunity cost to spend more, and we also made the argument that even if it's not just students, they're forced to spend more because colleges believe that Uncle Sam is basically applicable in the future.
Do you have a question?
Sure. So on our case, the Edelman study you cite, how many how big is the study against? How many examples does it look at?
I would say it's much more of a summary of other
Well, you just have to
studies.
answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a study in itself, it's a summary of many other studies.
Okay,
So
yeah.
for example, yeah, it says that the research suggests that tuition would not increase after one forgiveness.
Again, you're not
And then it analyzes multiple different.
Well, what's the database that Edelman looks at?
I mean, it's multiple different sources. Again, it's a summary
Okay,
of
you're not
multiple
answering the
different
question.
pieces of
What's the
research.
database out of all the studies that Edelman looks at?
Multiple different sources. Multiple
Okay,
different
and out of
databases.
all those sources, what is the conclusion that Edelman comes to? It's only based on a single college in the entire United States.
No, that's
How can you say
not.
that it's about the Tennessee Project? How is that indicative of every single college in the United
That's
States?
one part of the Edelman evidence, but the idea that our article, which the exact title of it is, the research suggests that student loan forgiveness will not increase tuition rates,
Okay.
and then analyzes, wait, could I just finish this thought, please? And then analyzes multiple different studies. The idea that it only analyzes one is a little ridiculous.
I mean, okay, I would love to see your cut of Edelman, but
Yeah.
from the Edelman evidence,
I mean, I already sent it to you.
yeah,
Did I-
the conclusion is only about the Tennessee Project. It's one school. It's not about every single school in the United States.
No, that's just one example that it looks at, but it's looking
Okay,
at many
so
other
can
stuff.
you read me a sentence that talks about other examples?
I mean, I can show that to you after cross, but I have a question. On your argument about better, like money being better spent elsewhere, can you name a single time that the government has taken away from welfare to forgive students?
That's crossfire, but the opportunity cost greed argument we've made is that, for example, there are large statistics about the way that the government spends money being used more efficiently
But
by
can you give an
triggering
example?
algorithms. So yeah, can you just show an element that talks about other studies?
Sure.
comparison and all label work. Okay, setting it up. Let's start on the argument about the SAVE plan. They have told us that the SAVE plan will not work and is a bureaucratic mess. But if you look at their evidence, it analyzes past examples failing, and the 30 people are 30 people who qualified, not people who enrolled. The SAVE plan has learned from Biden's mess. Biden has learned from the repayment plan's mess, which is why their own NOVA evidence finds that he has made great policy decisions to adapt new planning to incorporate the mistakes of the past, which is why instead of 32 people qualifying, 20 million people qualify and 4 million are already enrolled. But the argument you're voting on in today's round is our argument about college tuition. They have made the Edelman analysis on moral hazard that there would not be a reckless spending spree, but the college tuition argument is far more devious of the institution. What happens is because student loans get forgiven, it means that these colleges see an opportunity to charge more money. It is not reckless spending that students engage in. It's must-have spending because colleges have just inflated prices because they think it will charge more. They've made a few responses. Number one, that it's not profit maximizing. No, colleges want to do it right now, but the thing is, because of current trends, they need to save face. They're approaching the status quo with honey, not vinegar. But the only risk of changing that is whenever you forgive student loans. A lot of analysis from McCuskey, which is clean conceded, says that in a study of 30 years, and not just their evidence from the University of Tennessee, a $1 subsidization of student loans increases tuition by 60 cents. It's the opportunity for colleges to balloon tuition. They say they don't want to be greedy. Number one, this is one state's analysis. Number two, the evidence actually says that colleges don't want to move first because they're local policies. But when we do forgiveness on a nationwide scale, colleges will easily fall into the fold, and with their buddies all around them, they'll crowd out the average American from attending college, costing millions of people the opportunity to go to college. Here's why that matters. If people don't go to college, there's no way to revive the American dream. A lot of the people that they talk about who are impoverished are people without degrees who are struggling to get back on their feet. And if there's no college degrees, it means there's no more innovative small businesses, which means that these arguments are incredibly hard to start if you don't have a college degree. But if you don't want to look at where we're winning, you can look at where they're losing. Although Michael gives one of the prettiest speeches I've ever seen, there are two terms that are conceded. Number one, that because forgiveness means that it would largely be unequal because white Americans borrow more in the upper income bracket. The return for each dollar is 95 cents for them, but only 30 cents for low income people, meaning inequality goes much more in a drastic scale. Although they want to address the root of America's problems, they exacerbate all the issues. On small businesses, they've conceded that student loan forgiveness is 75% of small business incentive to hire, which also means if you forgive, you decrease productivity and recruitment because 75% of the incentive for people to go into small businesses is gone. Additionally, on reviving the American dream, they've missed the mark. 64% have no student debt. They're just people in poverty. On small businesses, it's conceded that their increase was short-term because of COVID, nothing more.
Okay. We have 2 minutes and 42 seconds to wrap it up. But before we get there, can I call for the recut of the NOVA evidence and the $1 leads to 60 seconds?
Do you want the analysis after the 60 seconds?
Just the code. Yeah, just the evidence. And then the NOVA evidence.
With the analysis on those issues. We're 32 people. You're like you conclusively come to the new program say have yay.
No. I'm talking about you saying that our evidence concludes that Biden is changing his team.
No, that was analysis we made one. Yeah, analysis is just policy makers are smart and then started by people.
Yeah, across it's gone through evidence. Yeah, you don't have the cards to say we don't have it. Say it's an analytic. It's fine.
Okay.
It's no biggie.
And then when we get that.
It's not great. It's perfect. It's not recording. It's not doing anything hurt.
We're gonna start wrap.
first time in American history, a generation of Americans is less well off, both in wealth and well-being than their parents, and it is only getting worse. It is clear that there is a crisis, and the answer to that is clearly not to do nothing like they advocate for. Instead, we'd say the solution comes from our first argument about opportunity, which is where we're winning the round. Is that right now, because of student loan debt specifically, an entire generation of Americans has low economic freedom and is preventing them from doing things like buying homes, starting families, the things that allow them to accumulate wealth. However, our experts from Harvard Business School find that when we forgive student loans, what happens is 30% higher job mobility, on average 25% decrease in all of their other debts. It gives them the economic freedom that the American dream promised them, and can lift millions of people out of poverty by reducing economic inequality. At the end of this round, they essentially have two responses to this argument. The first is that it disproportionately benefits the rich, but Michael does respond to this, and what Michael explains is that it does not matter if more actual dollars are given to the rich when the burden we are alleviating is far more significant for the poor, which is the Banerjee evidence that goes unaddressed. But secondly, what goes unaddressed is the college evidence that finds that these wealthy borrowers that they're talking about have private loans, not federal loans, which means that it isn't affected anyway. Secondly, they say that it hurts small businesses because most of small businesses hiring is affected by student loans. Think about what this argument is. This idea is that people go and hire for small businesses because they need money to pay off their student loans. Obviously, people are going to still want money and still want to have jobs in a world without student loans. But now, let's talk about their arguments when they're not winning there either. First, let's start on this idea that the SAVE program is going to solve the issue that we talked about. They say that our evidence is all about the past, but they completely ignore the Sheffy evidence, which looks directly to the future. It finds the bureaucratic issues regarding these payment plans, the data issues that have been plaguing the Department of Education are structural. And for the very same reasons that for the last 20 years, the type of payment program that they're talking about has helped just 32 people out of 2 million possibly enrolled applicants, that these SAVE program will continue to fail in the future. They say that Biden promises he will improve it. I'm sure he does, but they have not contested the analysis that proves why this isn't true. Now, let's talk about their argument about raising tuition. They say only the institution matters, but that is not the case. They have not contested the evident evidence, which finds that students are not stupid. They're not going to take on horrible debt that they can't pay off, which means that they won't overborrow. They say that colleges will raise their tuition regardless, but think about this logically. That means that despite students not coming to their colleges because they aren't willing to pay, that they're going to continue jacking the prices up. That's clearly not the case. But then, all of our argument comes before there is fundamentally on probability. All of these research goes our way. In the past, when you've seen forgiveness, what you've seen is people paying off their debts, being responsible, not doing the outlandish spending that they're talking about. But then again, the evident evidence, which is the only evidence that actually looks at student loan forgiveness, because there's 60 cents evidence is not about that, it's about subsidization, flows our way.
Okay, are you ready to cross?
Yeah.
You can have the first one.
How much of America's poor is impacted by student loan debt?
Our argument is that the conceded Banerjee evidence, which was in my rebuttal, not addressed in the summary, says that overwhelmingly the lower income Americans are the ones most affected by student loans.
That's great, but when I did pick this argument, how many
Wait,
people
what?
was that?
Alex went up in summary and said, you haven't addressed the Banerjee
Okay,
evidence.
fair enough.
There's no
How many
point.
people is that? Like, what's the proportion for American
I mean, I'm not like an omniscient economist, right? I don't know exactly how many Americans who are lower income are being burdened by student loans. But you conceded the majority of the burden falls on them.
I'll answer for you though. The conceded wolf evidence finds that 64% of Americans are not burdened by student loan debt. So what's the scale of your argument?
Okay,
Yeah.
40 million people are, right? America's a pretty big country. Just because 63% don't have student loans does not mean that the 47% of a country with 330 million people in it don't matter.
You've had two questions to
Yeah.
take one. Okay. Let's talk about reckless spending. So, insofar as you can see the element evidence that borrowers will not be reckless with their spending and will, for the illicit evidence, invest it, save it, and pay off other forms of debt, wouldn't you agree that there's no increase in demand for colleges and thus there is no increase in prices?
I don't think we agree.
Why not?
Well, first off, I don't think it's contested in summary, so I don't know.
No,
Wait, that response is not
Let's actually go. What I heard in summary was that we say the borrowers are responsible. You say it doesn't matter. It comes from the institution. So my question is, if we take those things to be true, and you agree with us that students aren't going to be willing to overborrow, like, is your argument that just these colleges are going to skyrocket their tuition anyway, and they're just going to sit there with like empty classrooms?
For millions of students across the U.S., it's not a question of what looks risky. If a college increases its price by 15%, you must take out the loans to fund the college. It's not something that I'm going out to spend money
Wait,
on.
the element evidence says that.
Sorry.
Wait, yeah, but I'm about to respond to that.
Yeah.
Right. The element evidence says that even when we forgive student loans, borrowers will still not want to borrow very much and will have the same economic outlook
No.
on going to college, so they won't be willing to pay.
No, Edelman says that the reason why people would not be willing to borrow that much is because they would not want to spend on risky investments and reckless
No, that's
spending.
not.
No, this is like the response in summary that is conceded. Look, what Edelman says is that because the analysis done on Edelman is that because colleges exorbitantly increase their prices, it means that spending is no longer considered reckless and borrowing is no longer considered over borrowing. It's considered a necessity because colleges have increased their
But
prices.
our argument is that they cannot increase their prices because individuals are not more willing to spend on
Right,
colleges.
because
For the
they-
argument that we make
The
on that.
reason why they wouldn't spend is because they would think it's reckless. But if it's a college price, then that's not a reckless
How about this?
investment.
The
That's
individuals-
100% no, we really don't.
It'll just be implying a debate. Everyone good?
Yep.
Okay. My opponent says that today the Gen Z is like worse than ever seen before. But even if you help one generation now, affirming is both a hasty plan and ensures that all generations are even worse off than we've ever seen before. Look, this debate is really simple. My opponents have conceded that if student prices if college tuition goes up, then one, it means that it expands the income inequality gap that they're trying to solve for because low-income students cannot afford high tuition prices. They've also conceded that this kills small businesses because A, there's less people going to college, meaning there's less education, and B, on that this hurts the economy. This means that if you believe there's even a 1% chance that affirming will increase college tuition or increase reckless spending, you vote for the neg right there. Let's explain why we're winning it. The only response that my opponent makes is this Edelman evidence, but it was contested in every single speech. The Edelman evidence, one, is only one example, and two, is talking about subsidization, just like our evidence does. But you should prefer our evidence infinitely over theirs because one, it's a 30 years long study that's more holistic than theirs, and two, it actually looks at these statistics. What it concludes is that because of high income prices and because colleges think that Uncle Sam will foot the bill, every additional dollar that the American government subsidizes, colleges increase prices 60 cents. This is definitely the most probable because it's also empirically proven. Even then, let's talk about why the status quo is getting better. My opponent says that in previous plans only 32 people qualified. Yes, the system now is not perfect, but we should pick the lesser of two evils, which is the status quo. If there is a fire going on, we do not add fuel to the flame. As of now, the same plan might not be perfect, but they have conceded that even if there are structural issues in the solutions that Biden is proposing, those are all getting solved. As of now, 20 million people qualify for these programs rather than just 32, and already 4 million people are enrolled. If you don't want to look at where we're winning, you can look at where they're losing. The equality term was 100% conceded coming out of summary. Remember that even if we are benefiting a lot of people, because you increase the disparity gap, you're still leaving those who do not have college degrees or even have loans worse off. You're expanding the gap, and on that, because they make the argument that inequality is the crutch to solving poverty, the affirmative does nothing but make the problem worse. It's an incredibly easy neg ballot.
We have a minute and 47 seconds of prep time. Starting now.
By the way, Edelman evidence and shows the evidence used to. What was the tag on it?
Oh, I can see that.
Yeah, just appreciate it.
place where you're going to look is to our case, where they have uncontested that for the first time in history, according to the CNN evidence, this new generation of Americans is less well off and has lower well-being than their parents before them. And that this is because of student loans, and that an entire generation of Americans have been robbed of their economic mobility. Also uncontested is the Harvard Business School evidence, which finds that when you forgive student loans, it allows them to, for example, have 30% more job mobility, pay off nearly a quarter of their other debt, and ultimately frees them from this economic burden, helping 40 million Americans. At the end of this round, they have two responses. First, they tell you that Biden's SAVE program will solve for all of these problems. But remember the Sheffy evidence that analyzes the efficacy of Biden's SAVE program. It finds that number one, it's only helped 32 Americans, and number two, that the issues with the program are structural, that government support for it is going down right now, and that it is failing to help Americans right now, demonstrated by the fact that Americans continue to default every single day. The crisis is ongoing, we have won that point, which means you must vote out to act. But secondly, they extend this turn about inequality, which they claim is conceded. It wasn't conceded. They conceded both of our responses. Number one, that wealthier borrowers take out private loans, so the resolution, which only forgives federal student loans, wouldn't apply to the wealthier borrowers. And number two, the Banerjee evidence that the burden of this debt falls almost exclusively on the poorer Americans, which means if we win our case, we win the round. At that point, the weighing is also conceded. We agree, both of our impacts affect the other, but they have conceded the weighing in summary that the likelihood of their argument happening is very little because of the Harvard Business School evidence that finds that when people actually have their student debt forgiven, they are actually far more careful and they don't go out and just spend enormous sums of money on college, which means their argument is very improbable. But on their argument specifically, they also concede our Edelman evidence that the reasoning behind their argument isn't true because people would not be willing to pay more money because they still care about their economic livelihoods. Thus, colleges would be unable to increase tuition. Thus, we're winning their case, we're winning ours. It's extremely clean for the app.